Welcome to the November chart class. This is now the official beginning for the third time. We've had a little bit of Mercury retrograde action here, and of course we're coming into a pretty intense full moon. Yes, happy Thanksgiving to all of those of you who are celebrating the Sagittarian holiday that, as you may have heard me say before, is a Sagittarian holiday because Jupiter is the ruler of Sagittarius, and Thanksgiving is celebrated on the first Jupiter day. That would be Thor's day, the first Jupiter's day, after the sun moves into Sagittarius, which it did earlier this morning. Actually, it will earlier. See, it's confusing. It's already Thursday here, so it's technically Thanksgiving here in Bali. This is the international date line. But the sun moves into Sagittarius early Thursday morning, and then we celebrate Thanksgiving in the United States, which is a Sagittarian holiday because Sagittarius is about uplifting. It's about big ideas like fellowship, and it's about foreign travel, and foreigners came from another side of the world and had fellowship with the natives in the United States. And it's a time of remembering and celebrating all those wonderful and uplifting things. However, the dark side of Sagittarius is that it doesn't have a dark side. and of course, we have learned in the United States that the Thanksgiving holiday wasn't all as uplifting originally, as we were led to believe. But it doesn't take anything away from the fact that this is a time of year when our spirits rise. We come out of the darkness of Scorpio, the emotional intensity of that soup, and our energy moves upward and outward. And the idea of taking Jupiter's day, the first Jupiter's day in Sagittarius, to actually just stop and to be grateful and to be appreciative of what we actually have is certainly an acknowledgement and an honoring of the Sagittarius energy. So feel free to interact in the chat between Gail and I. We will respond as we can. Also, this is being recorded, I assume. Yep, it's being recorded. And I will post this sometime in the next couple of days. It takes a bit to actually transfer, render, and then edit the file. But I will get that up, obviously, not only for those of you who want to go over some of the material again, but also for those who have been unable to make it today. And so welcome to all of you who are here after the fact. What I want to do today, oh, the lights just came back on. It's just reminding of the Mercury retrograde. What I'd like to do today is I have several charts. I just want to jump in on each of them. As you know, I'm a great fan of using real charts for the actual curriculum because the charts themselves that we use tend to bring up the material, and rather than stepping through particular systems, I'm of the belief that when we do chart interpretation, that the best thing we can do is simply jump in. If you want to become an astrologer or become a better astrologer or even learn astrology, it's important to get the archetypes and the symbols down, to know what the various planets mean, to read about them. There are many, many, many excellent books now where you can read about various aspect signs, planets, houses. And those are like our scales, just like a musician learns to play scales and learns to play scales in different keys. Then for us, for us astrologers, learning about the archetypes is like learning to play scales. But the actual music is doing charts. And my belief is the only way to become a better astrologer is to do more charts. And that doesn't mean that you have to do them professionally for money. Matter of fact, Some of the best astrologers I know are technically amateurs because they don't do what they do for money. They do it for love. Um, and and so the actual act of looking at a chart and talking to someone about their chart is really the best way to learn. Asking questions, interacting. You don't need to have all the answers. In fact, many of you have probably heard me say before that if you meet with an astrologer who has all the answers, get the hell out of there, because they don't. Astrology shares an awkward truth with fundamental religions, classical Western medicine, and many scientists. And that is, many people who practice astrology like those other disciplines actually believe they know more than they do. Now, astrology is a great tool to learn more than we knew previously. For those of you who saw my Cosmic Quickie a couple of weeks ago that I recorded in the monkey forest here in Bali, it was about awareness, and astrology is a great tool to increase our awareness of things that were previously invisible. And from that point of view, we don't need to have the answers. We just need to be willing to look at things that we don't know about. And so we're going to jump in and do a couple of charts today, probably 2 or 3 charts. And I'm going to make sure that you are here. And the first chart that I have is a chart for Bernadette, and I know that you are here. I saw you here. So Bernadette, we're going to turn on your mic and video, and I got your chart here cooking, and away we will go. All right. Yay. Hello, Bernadette.
Hi.
All right. Away we go. So you are our next victim. You are our next person who we get to interact with about a chart. Talk to me for a quick moment. How well do you know your chart? What's your level of astrology?
I have a basic understanding of astrology. I know my chart fairly well. The aspects and stuff I get a little confused on. Math is not my subject. I've kind of dabbled in astrology a long time, but I'm not. Like, I know the basics.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is back out of some of these colored lines in the middle, and we're going to look at your chart in 2 different perspectives. We're going to look at it first with what I call the simple aspects. These would be the Ptolemaic aspects, the aspects that most astrologers learn. This is dividing a circle in half and a third. A half is an opposition, by 3 is a trine, by 4 is a square, by 6 is a sextile. And then the semi-sextiles and quincunxes for those who use them. So, and I've said this before, but just as a matter of introduction, I'm using SolarFire, and it allows me to set it up so that as the aspects get closer and closer in orb, the lines get thicker, and it's an easy visual way for me to look at a chart and go, holy smokes, this big fat blue line here looks like the closest aspect in your chart. And sure enough, Saturn is at 23 Pisces, trine to Neptune at 23 Scorpio. And so that is a trine, the astrological word for an aspect when they are in the same degree. In other words, they are both in 23 degrees of their respective signs. That is called partile. So you have a partile trine between Saturn and Neptune because they are both at the same degree. But for example, if you look at the square between Mars and Venus, that line is a bit thinner. Some of these lines get buried or stepped on by other lines, but you can see that that red line, that square, is a bit thinner because that aspect is about a degree apart, from 6 to 7 degrees. So just as a matter of orientation. All right, now, when I look at a chart, typically the first things we look at when we look at a chart is where's the sun, where's the moon, where's the ascendant. Those are all, you know, those are all real considerations. But there are other considerations too, and that is, are there any groupings of planets? And here we see a definite grouping of Saturn, Chiron, and the moon. So whenever we see a grouping or a cluster of planets, three or more planets in conjunction are called a stellium. And so here we see a stellium in Pisces. We will come back to that, but I'm just putting a little note here as to when we look at a chart, what stands out. The second thing that stands out for me are any close aspects. I look at the aspect lines, whether I'm looking at a chart like I am here visually, or if I'm looking at a chart with an aspect grid. And I will bring up an aspect grid in a little bit just to show you what that looks like for those of you who are unfamiliar with that. Because an aspect grid, oh, you know what? Let's just go here, go there right now. All right, so this aspect grid shows the actual aspects between any two planets. Let's come back to the trine between Saturn and Neptune. And by the way, all astrology programs, whether it's Kepler or Solar Fire or Time Pass, they all have a variation of an aspect grid. And here, if we look at Saturn to Neptune, we find Saturn over here in the table, and we go down to Neptune. Can you see where I am in the table here, where Saturn and Neptune meet? And you can see the symbol for a triangle, which is the symbol for a trine, and it says 0S13. It may be hard to read, but it's not when you're printing this out large on the screen. And the 013 means that it's 0 degrees of orb and 13 minutes, 0 degrees and 13 minutes from being exact. And the little s means that it's separating rather than applying. Astrologically, an aspect that is applying is stronger than one that's separating. Remember, an aspect is an angle between two planets. One of the two planets moves faster than the other planet, always. In this case, it's Saturn and Neptune. Saturn moves faster than Neptune. So this aspect is separating because Saturn moves faster than Neptune, and it is moving away from being exact. If it was exact, it would have been at 23 degrees and 7 minutes, because that's where Neptune is. And because Saturn is at a higher degree, Saturn is actually moving away. That's a separating aspect. Now let's take a look at the Venus to Mars square. And we'll interpret these in just a moment, but I'm just trying to give you a sense of how to interpret or how to look at this data. So we go to Venus here and Mars here, and where they intersect, it shows a square, and that has a 1A31, which means that the A means that that's applying. That aspect is stronger because Venus is the faster moving, and she's moving toward being exactly square with Mars. And it's about 1.5 degrees, 1 degree 31 minutes from being exact. So just a little bit of mechanics. I understand that with the magic of computers, one can do astrology today and still be mathematically impaired. And that's okay. You know, I look at this in the same way as at one point in time, if you flew an airplane, chances are you had to have built it because they weren't commercially available. Or if you drove a car, you knew how to change the oil and take care of the engine because there weren't repair stations yet. Now you can get in a car and drive it. Boom. And with the advent of computers, you can basically run a chart and away you go. But knowing a little bit about the back end mathematics can be important even if you are not mathematically inclined. Okay, so let's come back to this chart. And since the closest aspect in the chart, the fattest line, if you will, is the trine between Saturn and Neptune, let's start there rather than talking about the sun and the moon and the ascendant. because whenever you have an aspect that is so exact, regardless of where all the planets are by sign, that aspect is going to be significant. And so Saturn is the planet of containment. Saturn is the planet of structure. Saturn is the limits of perception. Remember, in the olden days before telescopes, there was no view of anything out beyond the orbit of Saturn except for the fixed stars. Saturn was the limits of perception. When Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto were discovered, our minds extended out into invisible areas of the universe. And interestingly, we had the rise of depth psychology and archetypal psychology, and we began to delve more into the electromagnetic spectrum, and the discovery of planets seemed to correspond with the awakening of that part of our consciousness. So Saturn is the limit of perception, but Uranus broke through those limits when it was discovered. That's the lightning striking and saying the limit isn't the limit, we can go beyond. And then Neptune is the imagination stepping in. Neptune is the dreams. It's the kind of taking those hard edges of Saturn and melting them so that the apparent surfaces disappear and we can go forever. And of course, then Pluto in some ways represents the forever. It's the unconscious, it's the hell realms, it's the process of death and rebirth. And we'll get there in your chart. But this difference between Saturn and Neptune in your chart is very significant because the two of them get along really well. In other words, for some people, Saturn is so strong that they can't extend their imagination beyond it because it makes them nervous or it makes them uncertain as to what those realms are. Other people have a strong Neptune and they're really good at imagining things and being a visionary and dreaming and intuitive and the ability to just be so sensitive they can pick things up without language and kind of that whole musical aspect. But for you go through life with a very interesting balance between what's real and what's imaginary. In other words, the dreams and the reality for you seem to flow back and forth from one to the other. On a good day, it's awesome, and on a bad day, it probably sucks. But the fact of the matter is that for you, Saturn and Neptune work really, really well together. And it increases your ability to use your imagination to bring things down to earth. That would be Saturn. And it also increases your ability to not be convinced that what you see is what you get, because there's always that sense of stepping further. Now, this becomes more interesting when we look at the fact that you are a moon in Pisces with Saturn and Chiron lined up in Pisces. And that moon in Pisces is kind of like a psychic sponge. I think one of the most difficult parts about having a moon in Pisces is the confusion sometimes of whether what you're feeling is yours or your friends or lovers or parents or child's or bosses or employees or just someone who happens to be standing next to you on the street. because those barriers with the moon in Pisces become a bit more porous rather than semi-permeable. Normally we have boundaries that we can put up that are real, and then we can allow someone in. But that moon in Pisces kind of starts out with a default state of no boundary. And obviously there are things in your life that you do to bring in boundary. And I think one of the significant things in your chart is that you were born with Aries rising, which is certainly an ascendant that is about the ability to create boundaries. And it's interesting because in some ways, with the moon in Pisces, which is the softening of the boundaries, it's like you can probably, people who don't know you might sometimes think that you're either a bit of a hard ass or you can come on a bit, you know, wielding your sword, so to speak.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
and we see here the nod and the what I call the laugh of recognition. But it's not you. It's the tool you use to create enough boundary to keep people out of your space, because otherwise it's difficult for you to tell where you end and they begin, or where they end and you begin. And so that Aries rising really works for you. And of course, the rising sign in ancient astrology was the horoscope. The word horoscope means our view. It's like telescope is far away view, or microscope is tiny view. The horoscope to the ancients was what sign was rising at the time of day you were born, because they didn't have ephemeruses. So they basically figured out, you know, by the time of year, they calculated backwards by looking at what sign was on the eastern horizon before the sun came up, and they called that heliacal rising, the sign or planet in heliacal rising. And so for you, your horoscope is technically, in the traditional sense, Aries, which means that your horoscope marker or ruler is Mars. And here it begins to get interesting, because Mars in your chart is in Libra. You have Aries rising. Mars likes being in Aries because that's where he's at home. But in Libra, Mars is as far away from its home as it can get. And so Mars in Libra has a little bit of a tricky dance to do, because Libra is a Venus-ruled sign, and Mars is fiery and warrior-like, and yet in Libra, it wants to be nice. Now, Mars in Libra is not weak at all. It's just not an upfront fighter. In other words, you might come across with that Aries rising as a bit of a fighter, but ultimately you would rather fight by playing a game of chess. You would rather fight by the strategic side of it, because that Mars in Libra, in a way, is martial arts, because the Libra is Venus or art, and then the plot thickens when we see how close 1.5 degrees your Venus is to your Mars, and that aspect is applying. So we know there's a bit of, what's the psychological word? Cognitive dissonance. There's a bit of stress or conflict or tension between the yin, that would be the Venus, and the yang, the Mars in your chart. And, again, we're back to the good day, bad day. And a good day, that can be a lot of fun. It can be creative. It can be playful. It can be sports-like. It can be run off as, as sexual energy. The Venus-Mars can be very interactive and very playful. Of course, that Venus is in Capricorn, and so it needs structure. She needs structure. She needs solidity. She needs to know what's going on before she's actually going to play. And I don't mean just sexually. I mean in any way that play for you becomes something that becomes scheduled with containment. And then when you know what you're doing and where you are, then you can relax into it. But that Venus-Mars square, I think, is certainly again, it's a bit conflictive, and it can be hugely creative. Now let's come back to this cluster, the stellium in Pisces, because not only is your moon in Pisces, but nearby is Chiron and Saturn. That's about an 8-degree aspect, and on the moon I would use 8 or 10 degrees easily on a conjunction, and with Chiron in the middle, that strengthens it. And what this is interesting, because this tells me that all of that Pisces stuff that's very strong in your chart, it's in the 12th house. It's a bit hidden. It's not necessarily stuff that you wear out in the open. Again, I think it's that self-protection piece. But on top of that, Saturn is there. And even though your Saturn and Neptune get along, remember, Neptune is the modern ruler of Pisces. And so there's a little bit of a dance going on here between that trine from Neptune to all this Pisces stuff, because it works. And yet Saturn ultimately is there, and Saturn saying, I'm not just going to dissolve into the ethers and become, a space cadet. I'm not just going to melt into my imagination. Saturn there is going to prevent me from doing that. And I'm always looking for the next way to gain structure around all of those Piscean dreamy fantasy issues. And then we look to the next piece, which many astrologers would have started out with right at the beginning, but I'm working into this backwards. And that is the fact that your sun and moon are widely square, but all these planets in Pisces, and the closest is Saturn squaring your sun, but that Saturn squaring your sun really carries with it the Chiron, the maverick wounded healer, and the moon. And in a way, this is now beginning to deepen the plot of how perhaps your early family of origin stuff, your social conditioning, that the emotional wounds basically taught you can't just go out into the ethers, and be and be vulnerable all the time. And it's square to Sagittarius. Sagittarius, in common with Aries, is that it's fiery, and that Sagittarius square the Sagittarius sun square the Pisces Saturn, Chiron, and Moon basically says the way I deal with that is I go into action. I have big ideas. I'm ready to implement them. And as long as I take them and do something with them, then people don't really notice how spaced out I am and how, insecure or quiet or, deep, or all those things that you keep, buried back there. And that Saturn square the sun is another driver. We have Mars square Venus, creative. It's creative conflict. I have a personal trainer who at times has said no pain, no gain. And although I don't believe that's always true, I think of that when it comes to squares, because squares are not bad. They are just often the instigation for the creation. And so without squares, we don't do anything. We look at your chart and we see, the mid-60s had the Uranus-Pluto conjunction. I've said many times that if you were born prior to that period, you lived through the 60s, as I did. You didn't live through the 60s. The 60s lived through you, because you have that Uranus-Pluto conjunction. Yet its opposition to Saturn and Chiron and the moon and square your sun says, yes, it lives through you, but you're not one who jumps off the cliff into it. You're one that wants to somehow contain the energy and turn it into vision, turn it into something that's real, turn it into something that's long-term and that holds its position. Now, I stop and we listen to you. What made sense of that to you? What didn't make sense? This is your feedback. This is why we do this live, because in order for us to learn, it's the feedback that we get that really then tells us where we go next.
So it's interesting, right? Just hearing you go through my chart, because yes, in my early childhood, there was many conflicts. I was born into a Catholic household, and I am a fourth generation psychic, but I didn't know there was other psychics in my family till I was in my 30s. And I became a professional psychic, not by choice, kind of backed into a corner by spirit back in 2000. But up until then, I ran from it. I was like, I'm not nothing to do with that crazy shit, nothing to do with the metaphysics. I will study it quietly. Nobody needs to know. And was super successful in the business world. And so I finally found a way to use all of it, but it was major conflict for me. And I'm not one of those I'm not an airy fairy one. Like, it has to be structured. Like you're saying, like it has to be grounded in truth. It has to be grounded in teachings. It has to have a structure to it and a reason for me to even use my gifts to help people. Like I use psychology. I use other tools to help people move through their stuff, not just to give them some fortune telling thing. So for some people that works for them, but for me, it's like, it has to be very, very, very structured. But
Okay,
I
thanks for
struggle.
sharing that. I'm going to cut you off because you have a Mercury in Sagittarius, and if someone doesn't cut you off, you'll go on forever. No.
Yes.
Um, by the way, that Mercury in Sagittarius is trine your ascendant very closely with, it's a degree less than that away from being exact. I don't have aspect lines drawn to the cardinal points to the ascendant, IC, descendant, and MC. But this allows us again to see how you use your communication up front in people's faces, kind of saying what it is you're picking up in a way that is very different from the Piscean stuff. It has direction, and it has vision, if you will. But I want to come back to this T square with the sun square the Saturn, Chiron, and Moon on one side, and the Uranus Pluto, that kind of sudden breaking through into the unconscious realms that may be part of your psychic gifts, that on the other side, but all squaring the sun, and in some ways that being a great dilemma. But the blessing in your chart is that whenever you have an opposition and a planet square both sides, that makes a T square, that planet at the apex or the point of the T square becomes very important because that's the fuel, and in your case, it's the sun. That's great. However, it can be problematic if there's no easy expression of the energy. And in your chart, Neptune becomes the out, because Neptune is trine to one side of the opposition and sextile to the other. And here, if we just look at the numbers, it doesn't quite do it justice, because Neptune is 23. That's a degree away from it being exactly sextile to Uranus, and 3 degrees from Pluto. But the fact is that it falls right in the middle. And so it pulls that energy in. And so this Neptune, again, the psychic, the intuitive, the spiritual piece, becomes the way that the tension of this T square is resolved. Got it?
Yep.
All right. One quick thing I want to do, and that is I now want to just quickly add in the other aspects that I would normally use doing client work. We will ease into these, over the weeks and months ahead. But here we have another whole layer of noise, and I don't want to dig too deeply into this. I want to point out one thing in particular. And by the way, the red lines are squares and oppositions. The blue lines are trines and sextiles. The orange lines are half squares and square and a halves. The yellow mustard colored lines are 1/5 of a circle. They're magical creative quintiles and biquintiles. And the purple lines are 1/7 of a circle, 2/7 or 3/7, and they're the septiles. Now, when I look at your chart, there's 2 incredibly important things, and I'm going to isolate them here very quickly, and then we are going to move on. We are going to just show the 5th harmonic, or the division by 5. Those would be the quintiles. And what I want to show you here is Jupiter in your chart, where if you look at Jupiter normally, it's not very strong in your chart. It's not part of all the other, constructions, the T square and the T square with Neptune. It's just kind of, it's hanging by itself, kind of. Except when we look at the sun to Jupiter, it's a biquintile. That's like a 5-pointed star, but it's not points that are next to each other. And so this is sacred geometry that slips through the cracks if we're only looking at 12-fold signs, because 5 doesn't divide into 12. But the 5-pointed star, unlike the 4-pointed star, which is the cross, which is the symbol of Christianity, the 6-pointed star, which is the symbol of Judaism, The five-pointed star is really the symbol of the pagan earth religions, the feminine principle. It's the magic of what's not apparent on the surface in the three-dimensional world. And yet there's a Venusian overtone to this. There's a creativity. And this shows how connected, I mean, you have other quintiles too, but this one is so close and so powerful, it basically elevates that Jupiter, which is the co-ruler of Pisces. It elevates that Jupiter into a position of extreme importance because it's feeding in a very magical and creative way that is not physical into the whole adventurous, kind of expansive thinking of the Sagittarius. That's point one. Point two is that when we go to the septiles, your chart rocks it. All of a sudden, there are three important, loud, close septiles. The closest is between Venus and Saturn. I'm sorry, between Mercury and Saturn. That's 21 minutes, so that's like a third of a degree. And septiles are otherworldly. This is the psychic stuff that happens like out of the blue. This is the lightning striking metaphysically, and it's the part of you that's not connected to this realm, but the part of you that's connected to other realms. And even though you can say all the strong Pisces stuff makes a case for that, the trine to Neptune makes a case for that, this is another layer of how important all that stuff is. Are you with us?
Yeah.
Okay. Ready to move on?
Yes.
Anything you want to add or subtract?
No, I'm going to have to come back and watch this again because it's fascinating.
All right. Then we are going to jump ship. Bernadette, thank you for sharing. By the way, a few months down the road, we will switch gears and talk more about transits. Someone mentioned, I think Christine mentioned that your awakening, your psychic coming out, if you will, was around, you said around your 30th birthday, which is certainly Saturn return, and 66, 76, 86, 96. That was also around the time, not only your Saturn return, but let's do this real quickly before we bail, just because it's helpful to. So when we look at a chart, one of the other things that I always like to look at is a bi-wheel of where the planets are now compared to where they were when you were born. And in Solar Fire, I can actually move this wheel backward and forward. So right now we can see that Saturn is reaching the top of your chart. This is very significant. If we go back a couple of months ago, Saturn would have been, a few months ago, it's actually last fall, there it is right there. Last October, November, Saturn was coming to where the sun was when you were born. It's not a Saturn return, but it certainly feels like Saturn's, kind of on your case. And this is usually a very critical point in our development. My favorite astrologer, Grant Louis, wrote that this was the time when the chickens of ambition come home to roost. In other words, what we've been working on works and what we haven't been working on doesn't work. We usually get a mixture of the two. But in your chart, that was kind of leading up to Saturn going up to the highest point in your chart, which it's really been playing with since February of this year. It lined up with your Venus. There may have been some difficulty either with money, with love, with isolation, backing off of something not working out. Saturn turning retrograde and then direct again. And now, and when I say now, I mean now, Saturn has moved into your 10th house, lining up with your Venus again. And I think over the weeks ahead, you'll feel a little bit of freeing from whatever the resolve is that you have taken from whatever this thing was over the last 6 months or so. Does that make sense to you?
It does. It feels more like 12 years, but yeah.
Well, there's one other thing that I think is important to mention here, and that is over the next couple of years, Neptune is moving over, toward your moon. And I think that whatever you have in the realm of psychic understandings, spiritual practice, that's going to be, the ante on that's going to go up, or probably already is. The good news is you'll be more creative and more intuitive than ever. The bad news is that sometimes it'll be difficult to manage that and to understand, you know, what you're imagining and what's real. It can be confusing, and we can talk more about that some other time, but I just wanted to put that marker there before we bailed on you completely. Are we okay?
Thank you. Yes, I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
All right. All right. Thank you. So the first thing that I notice when I look at Lucia's chart, after having looked at Bernadette's, is how amazingly, miraculously different almost every chart is. And this is, of course, the wonderful thing about astrology, because everyone's different from everyone else. And so we look at charts and we see very, very different patterns, and people go, oh, my chart's so different because it's this and not that. And have you ever seen a chart like that before? And my answer is, to every chart I've ever looked at, is no, I've never seen a chart like this before, because every chart is different. In looking at Lucia's chart, I would kind of begin with how much of the chart is above the horizon. There are, and I don't use Chiron when I do this part of the analysis. It's not one of the traditional planets. I stick to the Sun through Saturn and Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. But the fact of the matter is that Venus and Saturn are beneath the horizon, and all the other planets are above the horizon. And the horizon represents the difference between objectivity and subjectivity. And so there's a sense here, it's been said that people with most of their planets above the horizon live their life in a goldfish bowl, meaning that people see you. When they see you, they can walk around you and see all of you, so to speak. Doesn't mean you don't have any secrets. I mean, hell, you're a Cancer sun. Obviously, Cancers keep deeper secrets than even Scorpios, perhaps. There's an interesting conversation to have, because there are different strategies of keeping secrets, I think, or of holding information in. But the fact of the matter is that with so many planets above the horizon, including the sun and the moon, there's a bit of what you see is what you get in your life. There's a bit of, this is who I am, and here it is. Now, the fact of the matter is, though, that the sun in Cancer lined up with Mercury is an interesting piece to be in the seventh house for a couple of reasons. First of all, the sun is how we shine. It's how we shine our light. In Cancer, there's a sense that we shine our light cautiously, carefully, and mostly when it feels safe. The Cancer sun, it's because every planet relates to a sign, every sign relates to a planet. These are the traditional and modern rulerships. I like to use the word associations rather than rulerships. That's just one of my quirks. There's no reason for for you to do what I do. But the fact is that the planet, and I use the word planet in the Greek sense of the wanderers, including the sun and the moon and Pluto, the planet that's associated with Cancer is the moon. And so we start off with anyone with the sun in Cancer has a bit of a dilemma, because they shine their sun by receiving energy. It's like the thing that lights you up is receiving other people's energies and reflecting that back. There's a sense that that Leo wants to be seen out in the open. That's the Leo sun. But the Cancer sun basically wants to be acknowledged in a quieter, in a more emotionally safe space. And with Mercury conjuncting your sun in Cancer, this is a bit of a, how do you reflect? And I say reflect because A, that's what the moon does, and B, because this is in the seventh house being the opposite of the first house self. The seventh house is the other. And so when we see planets in the seventh house, we often ask, how are these energies projected into your outer world? And so in some ways, this Cancerian energy becomes part of the relationships that you have, and the people out there who are Cancerian, who are receptive, who are what's the word I'm looking for? Emotionally. There's a passivity, but passivity should not be mistaken for A, weakness, or B, inaction, because that Cancerian energy has a strong ability to hold the energy. In your chart, the Sun and Mercury, the Sun in particular, is very closely partile. This is the second Neptune chart in a row. So even after saying your chart is so different from Bernadette's, the fact is that we bop back to, where'd Bernadette go? Somewhere here. I have a bunch of charts here. There's Bernadette. Her Neptune is partile trine to her Saturn. That's the closest aspect in her chart. And in your chart, Neptune is partile trine to the Sun. That's the closest aspect in your chart. And so it's very interesting that that becomes an important piece of who you are. And this also has to do with the magic, the Neptunian creativity illusions that you can create by receiving energy and reflecting it. I don't know a whole lot about you, but in an email, I do know that you do some acting work, and that certainly is reflective of the reflective. That's, I don't want to use that word there. That is certainly consistent with your ability to absorb and reflect, like almost like a magician, that kind of shape-shifting energy that Neptune does through Mercury, through communication. The other thing that's very significant here is the fact that your Sun is trine Neptune. It's also widely trine Mars. I say wide, it's not that wide. It's 6 degrees from being exact, because at 26 degrees, that's 4 degrees, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, and then 1, 2. That's 6 degrees away from being trine to Mars, but Mars is off into the next sign. And so that makes it a little bit interesting, because it's almost like Mars still hums the energy of the Sun from that supportive, kind of collaborative, easy-flowing energy of the trine, but it does it in a way that's bigger. It does it in a way that when you actually move, you move out in the world. You actually go places and do things. And I'm not saying that Cancers can't go places and do things, but the fact is that your Mars in Sagittarius is so much a part of you that the idea, the bigger picture, the world, whether it's physically or metaphysically, is all part of your playground, because there's not the same boundaries that a Cancer might have of simply wanting to stay home. And when I say stay home, I don't mean reclusively, like locking oneself up in one's house. I mean it metaphorically, staying home with family, with the consistent routines where you feel safe. And yet your chart with that Mars in Sagittarius certainly breaks out of that. Okay, one other piece of this puzzle is the fact that your Sun is involved in a trine. That's lovely and wonderful for expression of your energy physically and spiritually and emotionally. However, when you personalize those emotions with that moon in Virgo, and the moon in Virgo wide, but heading toward, applying toward an aspect with Pluto, and Pluto so close, partile conjunction to the South Node, oh, we will get there in just a moment, that this becomes an interesting piece that's interestingly and oddly relieved by this Jupiter-Uranus conjunction. that Jupiter-Uranus conjunction is hugely unique and significant and yours. Why is it unique? Well, Jupiter conjoins with Uranus about every maybe 14 years, right in there, every 14 years. Because Jupiter goes around once in 12 years, Uranus has moved a little further along, and it takes Jupiter another couple of years to catch up to Uranus. When Jupiter and Uranus align every 14 years, they basically bring an opening, a sudden kind of, like when the clouds in the sky all of a sudden clear and you feel like you can see forever. There's a part of your chart that has that. And yet that energy is different than all of that Cancerian energy and some of the other stuff we've talked about, because both Jupiter and Uranus are new to their sign. And I always find it, I know there's a teaching in traditional astrology that a planet in the 29th degree is called a critical degree. And I agree with that, but I think it's a bit more complicated and simple. And I don't think it's just the planet and the 29th degree. I think it's any planet that's very close to the cusp, that's cuspal, becomes significant because it's almost like the fetus coming in. Is almost like a surfer surfing electromagnetic waves, and the fetus actually picks the wave to come in. It's like surfers waiting for the right wave to take. And there's something here about your being would have been very different had that Uranus and Jupiter been back in Virgo, where Pluto was so close to the south node and the moon was in Virgo. This is the part of you that is technically, proficient in what you do. This is the part of you that moon wants precision, it wants accuracy, it wants to do what's right regardless of what other people think. There's a sense of that, not only the moon in Virgo, but Pluto so close to the south node in Virgo, that this whole piece is something you've done for forever, for past lives, for genetic generations, that you come from a place of needing that high level of accuracy, technical skill, perfection. And in some ways that makes you a bit crazy. Why? Because the moon is square to Venus, and Venus in Gemini doesn't like the specificity of the moon in Virgo. Because there's a part of you that just wants to be in the moment and go with the flow and go with the next distraction and kind of just be, likes being attracted to whatever it wants to be attracted to next in the moment. And yet that moon in Virgo will not let you do that. And this genetic past life weight of the Pluto, on the south node in Virgo, it's almost like you're too good at being right and real and specific to just allow that Venus, her druthers, to just go off and do whatever the heck she wants in any given moment. But then we get to the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction that basically says that when you bring someone else into the equation, and this comes back now full circle to where we started, because we started with the Sun and Mercury in the 7th house, that projection, that being involved in relationship. And I don't necessarily mean here just an emotional or intimate romantic relationship. I mean any sort of relationship with any sort of other. And that other can be a person, place, thing, idea. And in some ways, that relationship with the other is Libran. And when you're open to receiving it, then that Jupiter in the 9th house, in its own house, it's accidentally dignified because Jupiter in Sagittarius would be at home, but Jupiter in the 9th house is at home. And so this basically opens things up to new, to more, in a way that's very dramatic, but I think it involves other people. Now let's come back to one last thing, and that is your Saturn trine your ascendant. And here we have a whole different flavor. This is the earth part. This is the part of you that has patterns that work, that's determined, that's going to get to where you're going, that will basically take all this other stuff and bury it in different ways when you need to, in order to go through life calculating what you need to do in order to get to where you want to get to, in order to climb the mountain that you've created. Hi, Lucia.
Hi, can you hear me?
You got to get close and talk loudly. Your microphone either sucks or something.
Well, it's, I am the kind of person that wears my heart on my sleeve. So just by you saying what you see is what you get, that, and I am all of that. Like, I am very transparent in my profession and in my personal life. And the Uranus and Jupiter, I think I had questioned that before on the feedback, because it was very curious to me. The last few years of my life have been challenging, and I feel like I am breaking through and walking into sort of new roads right now. And but it's exciting for me. Like, I'm looking for adventure. Like, I'm not. I am that Cancerian. I'd like to say that I'm more like a cat. I love to be at home and snuggle and do that, but then I need to be out and have adventure and travel, and my mind needs to be entertained. I need to be grappling with new ideas.
Well, that's the Venus in Gemini. That's the restless, kind of always wanting something new to entertain you, so to speak.
Always. And I think
curiosity. That's the cat. Incidentally, I have a friend who a number of years ago, Roxana Muse, who wrote a book called Cancer the Cat. And it's her claim that, going back to Egypt, that Cancer, has a whole affinity with cats. So.
Oh, absolutely. I feel that. And I feel a lot of Venusian energy a lot lately, the last few years. It's been playing a great deal. I've been studying alchemy, I've been studying alchemy and Kabbalah, and I've been meditating to Venus. And so that's been playing a huge part. And I think I spoke to you about even that Venus in Gemini, which is my, attractions to people have to be of the mind. They could be as beautiful as they are, but if they can't appeal to my mind, then I'm bored, and I need that stimulation. What else? The Saturn has been curious to me. The Saturn in is my Saturn in Taurus.
Saturn in Taurus, and trine your ascendant. Partile in your ascendant. So that's the determined grounding, and sometimes you don't progress as fast as you would like.
Right. I don't. Yeah.
But you get there. There's a long-term, you're not stoppable when you're going somewhere.
Yeah, I'm pretty fiery. I can get I can be as sweet and adorable as a cat, and then I can get my claws out, and I can totally be fiery in that way.
Two things I want to say. I just want to keep it moving along, because I do want to get Jenna's chart up here before we bail. We're kind of pushing toward the end already. And Jenna has waited several times, and we've done an almost, so I need to make sure I get hers up also. But I do want to say a couple of things here, so I'm interrupting you.
No, please.
To talk about this Venus square moon. I find that squares between Gemini and Virgo are, I don't want to say stronger, but they're especially when the moon or Mercury is involved in one of the signs, because they are both mercurial. Gemini and Virgo are both associated to Mercury, or in traditional astrology, they're both ruled by Mercury. And yet Mercury functions in two very different ways. And in your chart, in your life, they function both ways, which are mutually exclusive and yet simultaneous. And the two ways are, in Gemini, Mercury, if I say Mercury, I mean any planet, but in Gemini, Mercury's only interest is curiosity, gathering more information, and connecting dots. Its whole function is to create networks of understanding by connecting disparate pieces of information. And so I've called Geminis the information sluts of the zodiac, because there's no judgment involved. There's just like, more data, good, I want it. I don't care if it's useful to me. I don't care if it's ultimately important. I don't even care if it's true. I just want information. Now, that's one side of it, and your Venus is there. So your Venus is attracted to smart people who can bring you information. Now, set that aside for a moment. In Virgo, Mercury doesn't give a crap about what it considers the noise of Gemini. All it wants is to discern what information is useful. And so on one hand, you have the Venus in Gemini saying, I love information. I want more information. And on the other hand, you have the moon saying, yes, but I need all that extra information to go away so I can focus on what's important. And this becomes a key piece to who you are. Yes, no, maybe?
Yeah, no, I'm absolutely insatiable with knowledge and information, and I just I'm constantly hungry for it. I'm constantly.
I also think that a good way to envision this, and I want you to think about this and get back to me on it, because you wear this so importantly. But I think that Gemini is like AM radio and Virgo is like FM radio. That AM radio is noisy, it's talk radio, you tune it, stations come and go, it's fragmented, it goes from one thing to the next. You hear someone talking, you yell back at them, you change the station. But it's sloppy bandwidth, it's amplitude modulation, AM. FM, frequency modulation, is so precise that you can get two separate stations over the same frequency, 101.3. That's exact Virgo specificity. And there's so much information coming over this narrow laser beam of a signal that you can get stereo music. And most people listen to FM by going to one station, and that's their station. They camp out on it. Whereas in AM, we tend to tune. Think about it.
Yeah. Well, no, it's a good analogy. I mean, and I'm also once I find what I've been working on, that I am very hard pressed to move. I am pretty stubborn about.
Okay. Two last things, and I want to move on. Not to shortchange you. We can be back at your time.
Sure.
One is the fact that transiting Neptune has been and is messing with the opposition to your moon, because transiting Neptune is, right now at about 14 degrees of Pisces. And again, like in Bernadette's chart, this is about the dreams coming to life. This is also, because it's an opposition, it's likely, hold on. Because it's an opposition, it's also likely to be someone else. And so the cautionary here is to clarify relationships, because, hiccups. Sorry. To clarify relationships, because when Neptune is opposing the moon, it's easy to misinterpret, misunderstand, or make assumptions about someone else's feelings, motives, energies, and or vice versa. And so just keep in mind, and it's not like things can absolutely be disastrous or go wrong, but there's a whole need here for clarification. That's the difficult piece. The positive piece, though, is that relationships can also be as spiritual and as creative as they've ever been in your life. And again, here, I don't just mean romantic relationships, I mean all relationships. The other thing is that Saturn is coming over your ascendant. And I mean, it's like inching up. It came up there back at the beginning of the year, retrograded back, and is now back. And this whole period of time, you'll look back at 2018 with Saturn coming around to your ascendant and trining its own place. And this is an incredibly powerful, changeful period. The blessing is that when Saturn hits your ascendant, it's also trining its own place, so it integrates. But when Saturn conjuncts the ascendant, this puts you into a new place in your life where it's often a second bump to fame or fortune or something going on that's, you know, that kind of can be a recognition, but it's also about doing what you've set up and what you're doing, but not necessarily doing what you ultimately want to do in life. And I think that for the next 5, 6, 7, 8 years, that as Saturn comes around towards your second Saturn return, you will begin to form another whole vision of where you want to go and what you want to do in the next phase of your life. And that doesn't mean you can't be happy now, or it just means that what you're doing is more about gathering resources and tools and learning. And you're right at the tip of this. It's like you're in the process of making this transition to settling into where you are rather than trying to get to someplace new, even though you certainly can get to someplace new. By the way, that Saturn will also, over the next year and a half, come opposite your Mercury and your Sun, with Pluto moving through that same area. And so we're looking at a metamorphosis between now and January of 2020, when Saturn and Pluto join at about 21, 22 degrees of Capricorn. And so in some ways, this is, I believe, ultimately transformative for you. But this is not about surprises. This is not about Uranian craziness. In fact, the Uranus piece of this is that Uranus moving into Taurus will also be coming up towards your Saturn. And so I think that there are some real breakthroughs coming for you, but I don't think there'll be surprises.
Yeah, thank you. It's definitely starting its course, and everything that you've expressed is certainly, I'm definitely brewing.
Yeah. And Christine, who seems to be a step ahead of me, although I didn't see your comment until just now, Christine. Yes, Saturn is on the ascendant, and that's what I just addressed. And that is a huge change. In fact, I would do that exercise that I think we did in the apprentice group, and that is going back and mapping Saturn around to your various angles throughout your life and kind of telling a larger story.
Yes.
Okay.
I will. Thank you. I know.
All right.
I know we have to move on.
All right. Yes, and I want to put Jenna's chart up with the promise that next time we will start with Jenna's chart. We're not going to get through it. I think we're already running toward. We're running toward the hour and a half, and I'm okay to go a little over, but I don't want to cut you short, Jenna. So, Lucia, thank you very much, and I will see you at the apprentice meeting next week.
Thank you, Rick.
And we have Jenna. Okay. Gail, thank you for doing your magic. Much appreciated. And Christine says, mapping Saturn is obviously my new favorite thing. And Christine, all I can say is that it's been my favorite thing for a long time. I don't always get along great with Saturn. Saturn's kicked my butt here and there in life in general, but I certainly respect Saturn and use it in this often. Hey, Jenna, finally.
Hello.
Here.
Hi.
Okay, and again, you're going to get shortchanged again, but and I'm not leading you on. I think I think that at the very first class that you came up, but I didn't have your data or something, and I said next time, and then next time, and so we're finally here but it's at the end of the class, so we're not going to go in as deep. And what I want to do, though, is just kind of touch the surface and set the tone. And I promise that next month we will start with your chart, especially because, damn, as I look at it, it's so juicy when it comes to transits. I mean, oh my God, girl, what the hell is now? Now let it be known that every other chart I started off talking about the natal chart, and with Jenna's chart, my opening line is, "What the hell is going on right now?" And which is very different. And this is, interestingly enough, when you get clients, if you're a professional astrologer, most people make an appointment when their life is falling apart or exploding, or they've met a new love, or they're making a big decision or change or something. But every now and then you get charts for someone who is gifted a chart. And doing a chart just for someone in the moment who's not having a need in the moment is often interesting, because sometimes there's nothing to grab onto. There's nothing in the moment happening that's strong enough that you can jump in. It's like going to a doctor feeling great, and the doctor says, "What's wrong?" And you go, "I'm feeling pretty good." And so there's really nothing to do. But if you go to the doctor and you go, "Oh, I get these headaches, or my back aches, or whatever," there's something to jump in at. And of the three charts that we've looked at today, Jenna's is the chart that basically it's like, well, what's going on now? And why am I saying that? So we're coming into this backwards, rather than talking about her natal chart and the fieriness of her Sagittarius sun, but and her Leo rising. But Jenna plays a bit of a shell game, because she seems fiery, and she is. Venus in Sagittarius, she likes fiery. Mars in Aries, there is certainly fire in this chart. However, we look at the Uranus, Saturn, Mercury, Neptune, and the moon and Jupiter, and all of a sudden we realize that there's 6 planets in Earth. And so regardless of how fiery Jenna appears, and she can appear, look, that Mars, again, I don't have aspects drawn into the ascendant, but Mars in Aries is partile trine to the ascendant at 14 degrees of Leo. So you meet Jenna and you meet this kind of like, well, if she's on, you meet a firestorm, However, that's not Jenna. There's a slower burning fire behind that initial presentation that is the sun in Sagittarius, that is aiming at the goal, of something off in the distance. And yet it's interesting that the close aspect, it's not partile, but it's within a degree. And that is the sun quincunx to Jupiter. And interestingly enough, in Jenna's chart, the 2 closest, loudest aspects are quincunxes, both within a degree. The Mars-Pluto is partile, meaning they're both at 14 degrees. The sun to Jupiter is 27 3/4 to 28 and less than a half. It's within a degree, but it's not partile, because one's at 27, one's at 28. Just a weird, term in astrology. But the fact that both of these quincunxes are so close leads me to want to talk about quincunxes for a moment. Then I'm going to come back to now, and then we're going to bail on you, and we're going to pick up some other things in your chart, because your chart certainly has more to talk about than could be squeezed. Well, any chart does, but then squeezed into 5 or 10 minutes. But the quincunxes, unlike squares, are not resolvable. Squares basically, it's like having that pain and working it out. Wait, and Evangeline says that Bernadette and I and Jenna, you're all late Sagittarians, is what she's saying, I think. Weird. Okay, not so weird, but weird. All right. So a quincunx basically doesn't have resolution, and here's the reason why. When you have two planets that are quincunx, which is Latin for 5, quinc, unx, 12, 5/12ths, in the Ptolemaic way of looking at aspects, two planets that were one off of an opposition, one sign off of an opposition. Look at your Mars, the opposition would be Libra, one off is Scorpio. Look at your Sun, the opposition would be Gemini, one off would be Taurus. When you have two planets that are one sign off of an opposition, those two planets, he said, were inconjunct. And what that word meant to him was that they were not aspected. They could not see each other, because in a traditional astrology, there's a sense of the rays of one planet being cast upon or being seen by another planet. And in the case of a quincunx, these two planets are invisible to each other. However, they can't quite make one another go away. So one of the things that I do, and I'm going to put you on the spot, but I'm not going to make you do this alone, I'm going to do this with you, is my quincunx exercise. And everyone else who's not on camera, if you do this, I promise you, you will know what a quincunx is. And that is, I want you to take your right hand and put it up around eye level, out around by your ear. And I want you to wiggle the fingers here. I'm not just doing something stupid. There's a purpose to this. I want you to wiggle, but keep it a little bit, make your elbow right angle. That's it. So I want you to look straight ahead, but make sure that you can see your fingers wiggling. Now, move it back until they just become invisible and you can't see anything. And now move it forward until you can see some motion, but you can't see what the fuck it is. You know something's there, but you can't bring it into vision, okay? Now, make believe that there's a solid steel beam connecting your wrist to your ear. And now watch me. I want to try to bring this into focus, and here's what I'm going to do. As I try to make it go away, I can't make it any clearer, and I can't get rid of it. Yeah, you got it. Okay, you can stop looking like an idiot now. But rest assured that I was sharing that space with you and I was doing the same. Okay, that's a quincunx. The quincunx is, it's there enough to be annoying, but you can't see it and you can't make it go away. I often describe it as the mosquito in the tent, or where I am in the tropics right now, it's the mosquito inside the mosquito netting when you're going to sleep. And you know it's worse than hearing it's hearing it stop. Because when it stops, it feels like it's on you, and so you go through this a few times, and then you say, all right, it's either the mosquito or me, and you turn the lights back on, you sit up, and you go, all right, I'm ready for you. Where are you? You know, and 5 minutes goes by, you feel like an idiot. There's no mosquito. You go back to sleep, and just as you're dozing off again, you hear the, that's a quincunx. So you have two of these quincunxes, one between Mars and Pluto. They have affinity with each other. The difference is that Mars in Aries is great in the opening volley, and Pluto in Scorpio wants to finish the deal. You know, one's up front and one's down deep. And in your chart, playing the difference between being here and now and playing the strategic long-term game sometimes makes you crazy, because it's the mosquito in the tent. You can't bring it into focus and you can't make it go away. You're nodding yes. Is this making sense to you?
Oh yeah, makes sense.
Oh yeah. And then the other one has to do with that long-term vision of the Sagittarius sun. And remember, Venus is in Sagittarius also. So you kind of like the idea of being inspired to do something greater, to go somewhere, to create your life as an adventure. This is what Sagittarians do so well. And yet Jupiter in Taurus says, not on my watch. You're not going to go off and do some great thing off in the future. Instead, we're going to take it step by step and get somewhere today, tomorrow, and the next day and next week.
Mm-hmm.
So both of these things are operative. And so is there a value to quincunxes? Yes, absolutely. I have a quincunx between Jupiter and Saturn. I won't bore you with my story right now, but I see it in operation. It makes me and those around me crazy, but it also, I've developed a skill out of it. And the skill is getting a lot done in a short amount of time because it has to do with the opportunity of Jupiter to take on too much and Saturn actually following through and doing one thing. For you, well, let me say this, back to the mosquito in the tent, is that you may never kill the mosquito and you may not ever get any sleep, but you're going to get really good at getting in and out of your sleeping bag. So the thing to look at is, how do these two things work in your life? And maybe even creating a chart where there's just the Pluto Mars and just the Sun Jupiter, to kind of look at them, isolate them from the rest of your chart, because there's gifts here in the annoyance that you have of dealing with those parts of your quirkiness as to how you manage those energies. There's something that you develop over time that becomes part of the gift that you have for yourself and to others. All right, last thing I want to talk about here before we bail, and like I say, I will come back and we will do a bit more on this whole Capricorn piece and on the Uranus so close to your sun. That Uranus close to your sun, is on a good day, rock and roll, exciting, crazy, I can do anything and will and did. And on a bad day, it's, oh shit, I shouldn't have. It's both of those. And in fact, what's interesting is that they answer to Saturn. And of course, why I said, oh my God, what's going on now, is the fact that Saturn, which was here when you were born, Saturn has gone around, all the way around once. And last November, December, Saturn, like in Bernadette's chart, I think, Saturn lined up with your sun. That was the chickens of ambition coming home to roost. You and Bernadette, was it Bernadette? I think so. Could probably get together and share stories, and your stories will probably have energetic similarities, but will be very, very different, especially since Uranus is so close to your sun. No sooner does Saturn make it all, stabilized, than it hits Uranus and it all explodes again. And so there's this kind of I think of Saturn and Uranus, which you have close together, but have recently had Saturn coming over your Uranus, returning to its own place, Saturn, and is now over the days and weeks ahead going to line up with both Mercury and Neptune. I mean, this is like right on the near radar, and this is all stuff that's a little bit of a revisit to when Saturn was there earlier this year. But when I see Saturn and Uranus together, to me, and I think I may have gotten this line from Rob Hand's Planets in Transit. I can't quite remember. But when they are so close together, this is an irrepressible force, that's Uranus, meeting an immovable object, that's Saturn. And so there's a real sense of that being part of what's been going on in your life now. And I'm going to give you a moment or two to respond, and then I'm going to end the session, and it's your turn. Who the hell are you?
Okay, well, I'm here. Well, there's a lot to say, but I'll just try to keep it quick. And maybe next time we can go in a little bit deeper. But yes, the Saturn return, as Saturn was coming up on my sun, I was finishing up. I have been an artist my whole life, and I kind of need to be in the arts just to feel like I am being fulfilled in a very foundational way. But after being in the arts for so long, I wasn't able to sustain myself financially, and I was getting really upset because I couldn't think creatively whenever all of my focus was going towards survival. So I decided to instead maybe maybe go into computer programming because I've always liked computers. And so I learned how to do all of that. I was actually pretty good at it, pretty natural at it. I got a corporate job. I was making money. I was like financially stable and independent for the first time in my life. And that was happening whenever Saturn was on my sun. Well, as Saturn started coming up on its return, I was realizing more and more and more the reality was hitting me that was not sustainable for me. I was finally financially independent, but my soul was paying the price. Like it was soul crushing to be doing that and to be putting all of my energy into that so that when I would come home, I'd have no creative energy left for the things that I needed to, do. So I decided to leave my job and go back toward the arts. And so I'm just kind of on this crazy ass journey right now of trying to figure out a way to find a balance between financial stability and also at the same time fulfilling my soul, and not just fulfilling my own soul, but I really feel like this desire to contribute to the world and contribute to society. It has to be meaningful. Otherwise, for me, like it loses its fire. If my heart's not in it, like boom, it's gone. Like
Right.
I can't sustain it.
Gotcha. Well, two things, and then we're going to bail on you. One is the good news is that as Saturn moves past the Mercury and Neptune, I think that things will settle down a lot for you. That's the good news. The bad news is that Uranus moving into the early degrees of Taurus is forming a quincunx, your favorite aspect, with Venus. And so the money issues may not die down as quickly as you want, but they could really explode into something that changes everything as that Uranus forms that quincunx with Venus. And over the next 3 years, which might seem like forever right now, that Uranus will come to your moon, and I think that will change everything.
Very cool.
All right.
So. Yeah, thank you so much.
And thank you for your patience. Like I say, we'll come back because there's a couple of things I want to dig in, and I want to look at the other aspects, actually, both in yours and Lucia's chart, although I think she just bailed. So that's it, guys. Thank you for your ongoing support, indulgence. If you have questions or anything you want to follow up on, I am accessible by email. You can always post directly in Patreon or to the YouTube once it's posted. But if you want a response from me, best thing to do is to hit me up with an individual email. For those of you who are in the Cosmic Apprentice program, I will see you guys next week. And other than that, have a happy holiday season. We will schedule December's a little bit earlier in the month. Rather, we've been doing these toward the end of each month so that we don't conflict with Christmas and the holidays. I'll shoot more toward mid-December, and we'll get you those dates in the next couple of weeks. And thank you all. And remember, as I always say, it's okay to think cosmically as long as you act locally. See you all later.